Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Simone, and I'm community manager with the OED marketing team. I'm delighted to be here today with Lauren Simon, who will be talking to us about her research around semantic transfer.
Great, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today to present my research. My name, as I mentioned, Lauren Simon, researching semantic change using the OED, and I'll launch right into it. So first, going over the broad questions and goals of my research. On the content side, the goal is really to understand what insights about the nature of changes in meaning we can glean from the OED. And from the OED data sets, particularly as the OED in its original first edition form is being wholesale revised into the third edition. Looking at those patterns in the data, and specifically at how they may or may not map to evidence of in cognitive linguistics of how human cognition may shape linguistic change. And then at a more meta level, understanding the challenges of using lexicographical data and specifically of using the OED, how as a researcher one should approach it, and as a further moving on from that, if it's possible to standardize those approaches into best practices for research into historical semantics using OED data. So obviously these are quite broad questions, and for any study it needs to be narrowed down significantly to have actionable, to have action items to actually complete the study. And so while the broad question is to understand the patterns that can be identified in how new senses developed from pre-existing lemmas in the 90 plus years since OED1 publication, it's the question was further narrowed into what if we take a look at a sample of noun senses that emerged between when the OED was first published and the revision over the past 20 odd years, and actually refer to a person or people. So there's the kind of circumscribing of that semantic category, which makes it really possible to do this kind of research. And once that data set is examined more closely, I focused more closely on specifically on those senses that were generated via metonymization, so that with the goal of more deeply understanding metonymization as a mechanism of semantic change, and ultimately that you can see that objective below. So to look more closely at metonymy from a cognitive linguistic perspective, the definition I used in the study is metonymy as the cognitive activation of a target concept via a source concept in the same superconceptual space. And that activation of the source provides mental access to the target. And so what do I mean by that? It's easiest to see that in a couple of examples. The example on the slide, Downing Street has gone overboard with regulations this time. Downing Street being a physical location, is actually activating what is meant by that, which is the governing institution situated there. And that notion of adjacency, it doesn't necessarily have to be, it doesn't have to be a physical adjacency, although in this case it actually is. That conceptual adjacency is really critical to making metonymization work. An example where physical adjacency is not the case, the metonymization of Kleenex, a particular subtype of this, and broadening of the terms just to come to mean any tissue that you might use. The source of the brand name actually activates the target of the item represented by the brand name. It's a different type of metonymization, but metonymization nonetheless, and the conceptual adjacency is clear. So with that context, the research actions that I took, and I'll walk through each of these, to analyze this OED data across 4 different types of semantic change, and then 5 subtypes of metonymization. And so it was necessary then to cull samples from the data, assess them, develop and apply tags, and then do analysis, quantitative analysis and qualitative case studies. This is the data in its raw form. And so you can see that it's obviously related to, but different from what you might see when you actually just log on to the OED website. You have this, you have the head word, you have the sense specifications, part of speech, etc. But all the way on the left, you can see that there are actually also unique identifiers for each sense. There's etymological data that is auto-generated. The etymological data actually specifies how a word entered the English language rather than the subsequent development of each individual sense. And so while it is helpful and interesting, it's not necessarily sufficient to for the objectives of the study on its own. And that's where, as you'll see, the tagging will come in. In order to cull the sample to begin with, as I mentioned, starting with new senses that were added to the first edition of the OED, were initially published, but were added then during the course of OED3 revision, so some decades later. That was then narrowed to a person-referring noun sample, and further narrowed to look only at those that were metonymized. So in order to define that initial sample of new senses that were added to existing lemmas, there are a few parameters, and I think this provides a window into the challenges of using lexicographical data. There are three goals that correspond to each of those parameters, the first being isolation of polysemy. And what I mean by that is that while new words, entire new words, are a very interesting topic in their own right, particularly what I'm interested in here is how existing words develop new senses. And so I restricted the sample only to senses that were added to existing entries, to exclude those that fell under completely new entries. The second goal, anybody who has looked through, even thumbed through a first edition of the OED will see, in some cases, significant differences as the publication was completed over the decades in how different letters were treated editorially. And so uniformity of editorial policy in terms of the organization of the entries and the different classifications of words versus compounds, for example, is very important to having a uniform data set. And for that reason, I restricted the sample only to senses that were added during the revision for OED3, where there is clearly from the outset a uniform editorial policy and decision-making framework. And so excluding those that were added as draft editions in the supplements or in OED2. And finally, and I think this is potentially the most interesting, is to control for improvements in language documentation. And so one of the major impacts on lexicography over the past half a century has been the advent of computerization and the digitization of many historical documents, which has led to many antedatings of different words and the discovery of many senses that are new to us, but not necessarily new to the language. And so to control for that, I restricted to senses that were first attested after their initial publication in OED1. And so those that have emerged from roughly 1880, depending on the letter, 1884 to and beyond. And so excluding those that were found to have emerged prior to that date. And I'll have a couple examples to show what I mean by that. So this is a particular tricky case, as I just mentioned, where you actually can see this is a sense from the raw data, and you can see that it is initially the earliest quotation is from 1885, where the OED1 publication was in 1924 of the entry that at that point did not contain this sense 6. But this sense itself was published in 2015. And so essentially you see that what was discovered here was actually a sense that did exist at the time of the initial publication of the entry in 1924, but simply had not been found yet. And so that doesn't necessarily represent a sense that is new to the language, but rather simply new to us because of the documentation having not been available in 1924 and being available in 2015. There are much more dramatic examples of this. There are examples of senses that were discovered that are actually completely out of use now and may have emerged in the 1600s and fallen out of use in the 1700s, and up to this point were not in the OED simply because the documentation had not yet been found, were added in the course of OED3 revision, and are excluded from the sample because they don't represent, are not representative of that particular time frame. So moving on from defining the sample, once the sample is defined, it's necessary to assess it relative to the overall OED to ensure that there's representativeness in the data between the sample that I'm using and the language itself. So as you can see, the assessment of the sample in terms of parts of speech is pretty closely tracks the overall OED. We see some discrepancies here in terms of initial letter between the sample and the OED. And these are explainable, which is also what I was looking for. Differences were bound to exist because obviously the revision of the OED is not complete yet. And so there are some letters that have been revised much more so than others. Particularly the revision began at M and moved M through R. And so the overall sample added many, many new senses to M through R, whereas after that point, revision proceeded in a non-sequential way. And so it makes sense then that you see those blue bars are particularly higher between M and R. A similar thing is happening here, and specifically as it relates to the cutoff points I mentioned before about when a sense entered the language. There are many senses, many more senses in the overall OED earlier in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then there are many more in the sample that are in the late 20th century. And so in those supplements in the in OED2, there's much more opportunity to include senses that were in kind of the mid 20th century, in that 1920s to 1960s time period. But then it really wasn't until the point of OED3 revision that some of these new senses had really entered the language and been attested for long enough that they qualified to be included in the OED. And so you see their overrepresentation in the sample because as OED3 revision proceeded, it started to capture many of those for the first time. This one is not as closely related to my study itself, but I think the data is really interesting and fun to talk about, which is the subject area labels that are applied to OED entries. While not they're not a perfect data set in the sense that their application is still not yet complete, and it as the revision is completed, there will be more of them. And the categories are in some cases inherited from OED1 categorizations in a way that doesn't necessarily, is not always helpful, but it is really interesting to see the new senses that were added to existing words are really, when you look at the subject area labels, you can see a cross-section of how society has progressed over that same time period. You see the massive rise, the massive representation of senses under computing, animals, sport, medicine, science, math, and so really you can see the technological progress represented here, and I find that particularly interesting. So moving on from the assessment of the sample, the next and a critically important step is developing the tags that would be applied to each of these new senses. And so when I thought about tags, there's 4 criteria to make a good tagging system. One, your tags have to be truly clear to understand, easy to understand. They have to convey the relevant information. They have to be comprehensive and cover 100% of the data and features. And they also can't overlap with each other or have conditionality, or else the tags become messy very quickly. And you can consider the categories of tags as variables and the tags themselves as the potential values of each variable. And so here we can actually see those categories, descriptions of the categories, of types of change, and the potential tag values. And this, in this case, we'll be focusing specifically on semantic transfer and metonymization itself. But there's also the senses of words can broaden, they can narrow. You can have conversion from a verb to a noun, for example, or the other way around. And you obviously see changes in word form quite often. And then it's often interesting, you have to kind of take a step forward and then take a couple of steps back in terms of developing the tags. Once you have the tags and to apply them correctly, you actually have to know how to go from point A to point B. What is your origin sense that this new sense developed from? And the dictionary has a lot of, the OED, it has a lot of kind of contextual information and information embedded in the structure of each entry that can help you specifically identify which sense most likely is most directly related to the new sense from the data set, but there's not a clear line from A to B. And so it's also necessary to apply some analytical understanding of the OED, its structure, and its compilation to determine the origin of any given sense. So in this case, we see a sense from the sample, developer, in the sense of a person or organization that develops a particular product or technology. And there is a cross-reference here, and develop as a verb is noted as an etymon, although, as I mentioned, the etymological information in the OED is specifically related to how a word entered the English language and not necessarily how sense 6a, in this case, may or may not have developed from sense 5 or from a sense in a different entry. And so before I move to the next slide, we note here that this sense from the sample was first attested in 1905. If we actually go to that cross-referenced sense of develop and we find the corresponding sense here, where the language is very similar, and it describing an action of developing a new product or technology, et cetera, we see that that's not attested until 1920. And while this is somewhat imperfect, it's necessary to make a reasonable assumption and a consistent assumption in these cases that given the discrepancy in timing, it's less likely that this particular sense of develop as a verb was that an ER suffix was tacked on to create the sense in the sample. So the question then becomes, well, where did it come from? And we can go back to that entry and actually look at the first 5 senses and see the pattern. The first sense is a much broader sense of developer, and just a person or thing that develops something in various senses of the verb. And so it's even giving us an indication that this is a broad umbrella category with the various senses comment. And senses 2 through 5 are narrowings into different fields that are otherwise completely unrelated: photography, building, exercise. And so really this is one potential structure of an OED entry that one might see. But this makes it much more likely that 6, the developer in the sense of developer of a piece of technology, is yet another one of these offshoots of ultimately sense 1, the broad sense. And so on the next slide, we can actually see we've identified that as the direct etymon. And then the tags applied, it was simply a narrowing of the scope of the word into a new sense, sense 6a. The change tags that we're particularly interested in with this research is those that fall under semantic transfer and lateral shifts in meaning. I'd already discussed metonymization, and so I'll move past that. But the other most common form of mechanism of semantic transfer is metaphorization, where the origin sense maps onto a target sense in a different conceptual space. And so whereas the metonymization is characterized by this adjacency, it's actually the distance and the necessity of a likeness or of a comparison across otherwise distant concepts or non-adjacent concepts that anchors metaphorization. And so in the example, they needed to repair his damaged tissue. You have 2 totally separate domains of meaning: woven material, cell structure, and there's a comparison there that is happening and enabling that use of the word tissue. It was not always straightforward to determine whether one of these senses developed via metonymization or metaphorization. This is an example of one where the formulations, there are plausible formulations for each. And so you have the direct etymon of a psyche in terms of the conscious and unconscious mind of an individual person. And the new sense from the sample is the notion of a collective psyche. And so the metonymic formulation would be as a compositional metonymization, where you have the psyche in the sense of the collective mental or psychological characteristics being that which is composed of individual psyches in sense 1c. The metaphorization would be a functional comparison, that the collective psyche is that which functions like a human psyche in the sense of 1c. And so I'll walk through in the next few slides ways to distinguish and test to determine which tag should be applied in cases like this. And this is an array of tests. There were other ambiguities. It's not just metonymization versus metaphorization, but this array of tests represents those that were used to distinguish between those two in particular. One example application of the reformulation test is, and I alluded to it in the discussion of psyche, it's simplistic, but it is actually quite helpful, simply to take what the proposed change is and try to put it into the canonical formulation of each of these mechanisms. And so with metaphorization, X is like Y. Metonymization, with the adjacency, X is part of Y, or X stands for Y. With metaphorization, the example from the sample of punch bag of a person who regularly receives criticism, punishment, etc., it's actually part of a broader metaphorization, metaphor of insults are like physical injury, and thus the person insulted is like an object punched. And the formulating it in that format makes it much clearer. Often it's not so much a test as a heuristic or a helping mechanism to uncover the information that's already there, rather than generating new information with these tests. With metonymization, a photogrammeter, a type of camera surveying instrument combination, the new sense is a person who uses a photogrammeter, and it actually metonymized from the sense of photogrammeter of the object itself. And so the item possessed or used is standing in for the possessor or user of it. Another particularly interesting test, and these are not always they're not always completely conclusive. You may have a test that will conclusively tell you that something is not metaphorization, but will not necessarily positively identify something as having come from metonymization. And so it's important to keep in mind that no single one of these tests is necessarily conclusive on its own, and it's more of a battery of tests helping you reach a threshold conclusion. But in this case, the source domain survival, the source domain never survives in the final expression in metaphorization. It no longer has its conventional meaning or reference. And an example there is sprouter, also from the sample of a child, in the sense of a child who quickly grows. The explicit source of plants is no longer present in the meaning once the word has once the sense has metaphorized, and it would be so the source domain survival, it's simply not there, and that is one sign that this occurred via metaphorization. In again, if we go back to the previous test, likening the child and their growth to that of a fast-growing plant. Metonymization, the source domain, not only does it survive, but is often necessary for interpreting the conventional meaning. The conventional meaning from the source is necessary to interpret the metonymized sense. And so in the sense of ride, as in he's my ride, you actually need the original meaning of ride as a ride in a car or on a horse. That meaning must survive to interpret the new sense, and the adjacency and relatedness that is core to metonymization is necessary. Finally, these are three out of, as you saw, many different tests, but this is also particularly interesting. The literality of expression, and this is one where it is more conclusive about metaphorization than metonymization. The target interpretation is always fundamentally non-literal. And so if we take the example of plank, in the kind of colloquial derogatory sense of a stupid or contemptible person, if you try to coordinate the original sense of plank as simply a piece of wood with that new sense of plank in a parallel construction, a zygomatic construction, what you will get is something that is semantically unacceptable. And so in the example, all the way at the bottom of the column of the plank crashed the car and was sawed in half, and you see the hash in front of that, indicating the unacceptability of it, the sentence is nonsensical. And so the interpretation of plank must be non-literal in order for it to, and that's a sign that it's a metaphorization. This is not the case. Something may only be superficially non-literal in metonymization. It's thus much less conclusive. Once these tags were applied and metonymizations could be definitively identified, they were further tagged into subtypes. These different common formulations of that ways that metonymization occurs: causative, compositional, locative, possessive, and representational. Here's a few examples of the types of metonymization that I'll later discuss in highlighted case studies. For causative, you have the source, in this case being an effect, an outburst, or a tirade of pop-off, and the sense from the sample referring to a person, a short-tempered, excessively outspoken person, is taking that effect of a pop-off and ascribing it to the person who is causing it and bringing it about. Locative, the sense of a dressing room, a changing room, etc., specifically in a sports venue, is being metonymized into to refer to those who are located in that location. And so, dressing room from the sample is the sense of the members of the sports team collectively. And so, in that case, you have the location being metonymized to come to refer to the people who are often, for whatever reason, in that location. So moving on to the findings, the prevalence of tag values. And it's important to note that these are excluding that in many cases there were senses did not undergo semantic transfer, scope change, et cetera, and that these are simply showing the tag values where one of these changes did occur, and there were many where, for example, only the scope changed and there was no semantic transfer. But keeping that in mind, there we go. Keeping that in mind, we see that metaphorization was the most productive of the semantic transfers, followed by metonymization. Interestingly, narrowing occurred at more than twice the rate of broadening. And so while there's not enough data to suggest with any definitiveness that there's a directionality to semantic change in that sense, it's worth noting that senses did tend to narrow. And there were a number of conversions from other parts of speech to person-referring nouns. This is a simply interesting, not necessarily conclusive, but interesting notion here, which is the top 10 combinations of the types of change accounted for about 85% of all the senses that in the sample. And what you see is that having a sense simply narrow with nothing else happening it was close with metaphorization, but 18% of the whole sample was produced simply by narrowing, and a further 17% produced simply by metaphorization or derivation. And it was definitely the case that senses more often and underwent only one type of change rather than combinations of change. These findings that are interesting with respect to conversion from one part of speech to, in this case, person-referring nouns. And among those senses that converted but did not undergo any semantic transfer, the majority converted from verbs. And interestingly, if we look at metonymization at senses that both underwent metonymization and converted, the majority of them came from adjectives and converted from adjectives. And as I'll discuss, that makes sense when you consider the fundamental adjacency underpinning metonymization, that a characteristic or trait would be very easily associated with a person or in outside the sample of an object, and that adjacency would be quite natural between characteristics and the nouns that have those characteristics. To that end here, we see that possessive metonymization was the most productive form of metonymization, and this again makes sense, particularly if when you think about it from a cognitive point of view and from the point of view of efficiency of communication, identifying a person, in this case, a person with certain characteristics or traits or something they possess that in many cases is physically on their person or apparent when you speak to them, is a very common shorthand, even casually, and if you think about nicknames, and is often a very efficient way of identification and of communication. So it does make sense that possessive metonymization is the most productive. And so moving on to the more qualitative analysis, I mentioned that I'd go back to causative and locative metonymizations. There are a couple interesting findings in each of these categories. Causative metonymizations, again, explicitly identify a cause to refer to an implicit effect, or the other way around. And it's interestingly, in all but one of the causative metonymizations observed, the person is the implicit cause. And so we're almost always seeing that the person referring noun, is in the position of the causer. And furthermore, that the actions that the causer is precipitating were almost always actions that are associated exclusively with humans, those involving complex emotions, thinking, or self-awareness. And so in this case, you see pop off the notion of being short-tempered, excessively outspoken, the ability to drive with ride, rehiring. Hiring is a complex kind of systematic organizational action, always associated with humans. And among those implicit effects, all but one of them were events that have been converted from verb forms, either alongside the metonymization or prior to it. And so that also makes sense when we think about the fundamental nature of actions, cause, and effect. Within the causative metonymization sample, there's some interesting, there's at least one interesting entry worth noting, and particularly in light of understanding the particular challenges of using OED data. Scrumpshander, in the sense of, I'm going to move forward just so we can go to the definition and then come back. Small articles, typically of ivory or bone, decorated with engraved designs. That's the origin sense. The sense from the sample is a person who makes scrumpshander, and as it specifies here in sense 2. And so if we go back here to the top of the entry, what we see is there's an etymological note about sense 3, saying that it apparently with the ending reanalyzed as ER suffix, and this ER suffix is the same ER that you would see to denote occupation, as a plumber or a baker, entertainer, etc. And so basically what it's saying is that at some point, this sense of scrumpshander as the small articles, typically ivory, bone, etc., was repeatedly interpreted, that ER at the end of it was repeatedly interpreted similarly to the class of words where the ER denotes occupation, as writer, baker, etc. And that over time that became conventionalized and as it became conventionalized, sense 3 was born. And so this was actually the only one where the person was not in the causative position, or where the person was kind of the result and not the source sense. And so the aberration is it makes a lot more sense when you see that note here about how this word came, how the sense came about to begin with. The final case study here upon locative metonymization. And it's important to note that location, not only physical location, but as you can see with Neolithic here, it can also be a chronological, it can be location, temporal location and time. And so again, locative metonymizations explicitly identify a place and to refer to an implicit object, or vice versa. And so interestingly, most of the senses that underwent locative metonymizations, even those where the definition describes an individual person, were supported by quotations that only illustrated plural use or were inherently mass nouns. And so how can we determine whether this is significant? A usage note is typically the best evidence that a sense is predominantly found in a plural form. But in general, in OED3, quotes are intended to capture the range of uses and its range of a sense's applications. So if the quotations cite only the more marked plural form, that would also suggest predominantly plural use. And so what you see, even with this, you see a clear note usually in plural for for technical, the sense 4 here. But then, and you see that again in the quote, technicals all the way at the bottom, and I can affirm that all of the quotes from that entry are in plural form. But even if we go back up to a Neolithic and the sense of the new sense, a person who lived in the Neolithic period, all of the quotes are are similar to the quote I've included here, where it appears in plural form. It appears solely as Neolithics. So what can we make of this? The fact that locative metonymizations are almost always referring to multiple people. Well, if you think about the most efficient ways to identify a person, location is not often one that is conventional. There are one-offs, like if you have a particularly small and specific location, like a phone booth, or if you are on a plane and there's a seat with a seat number. Those kinds of situational identifications are possible, but are not often the kind of thing that can be conventionalized into language writ large. Most of the locations here are actually designed to hold more than one person. And so in order to have a clear point of mental access for metonymization to work, it's much easier, and it makes a lot more sense that you would use a location to refer to multiple people. That it's a lot easier to talk about all of the people who lived within a given time period than to say Neolithic and try to refer to a single person from that time period. And so it's an interesting. The pattern is particularly interesting, particularly given how complete it was, that all of them showed this plural characteristic. And that's all I have today. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for listening.
So I'm going to start, Lauren, with the first question that we've got here, and I'm
Mhm.
going to put it on the screen. So here it goes. As a 40-something-year-old, I find it difficult to understand the slang that is used in the latest music, for example, pop and rap lyrics. How can your work be extended to understand contemporary colloquialisms?
So this is a great question, and my work already covers many contemporary colloquialisms. The problem with contemporary colloquialisms is that a lot of them are very offensive, and so while they're in my they're in my research paper, I haven't put a lot of them up on screen because they're either offensive or kind of sensitive, racially sensitive, or insulting in some way. Like, language is language, and the OED includes everything. And so, rest assured that these mechanisms and ways of understanding how something in a concept that is adjacent to another concept are certainly used often to craft colloquial slang, as I mentioned, nicknames. It just so happens that many of them are not entirely printable.
Thanks, Lauren. So here's the other question that we've got there. Um, metaphorization involves mapping of two domains, the concrete domain, aka source domain, and the abstract domain, aka target domain. So in your example, they wanted to repair this damaged tissue, the woven material or a cell. Which one is the abstract domain? Please explain.
And so, in my understanding, in my definition, the definitions I've used of metaphorization, the two domains don't necessarily have to be concrete in in one case and abstract in the other. But it certainly would require an abstraction to go um, from from the from a tissue, for example, of in the sense of woven material, to the human body and cell structure. In that case, it's more about the distance, the conceptual distance between the two, which would require an abstraction to get from A to B. But it's not that one or the other is necessarily concrete and one is abstract. The metaphorization itself is in some sense an abstraction that you need to move from this one conceptual space to another. But I haven't seen it in my work, at least, that there's necessarily a requirement to have one be concrete and one be abstract.
Thank you, Lauren. Now we've got here, this is just a comment, not really a question, but I'm going to put it up in case you want to comment anything about it. So
Yeah.
in this intriguing work, which recalls a discussion in Zarikov and Gentner, why do metaphors seem deeper than similes? They note words like bridge and sanctuary initially had only concrete meanings, but now can denote metaphoric categories such as something connecting 2 points
Mhm.
and a safe place, respectively. For sanctuary, the literal meaning of a whole building appears in 1340. Extensions to the church or the body of believers also appear in the 14th century. The first figurative usage appears 2 centuries later in 1568, and they go on to discuss similar examples.
Yeah, there's a lot in this comment, which I think is really astute. I think that it's in one of the ways that you can explore this, and I think which I'd love to be able to do in the future, is you can actually look across languages and see many similar metaphors that the notion of sunshine and happiness, even though you can take two languages that developed largely in isolation, separate from each other, and see something almost akin to what biologists would call convergent evolution, where you're actually seeing two independent species evolve to have similar characteristics because of a similar environment. And you might say that the similar environment in this case is the common condition of humanity, that something like the warmth of sunshine becomes associated with happiness across different languages. And so I think if you were to look across languages, you might find even more evidence to consider the depth of metaphor. Metonymization, on the other hand, it is definitely true that there's the requirement and the defining characteristic of this adjacency of the two concepts kind of necessarily prevents the sort of conceptual associations that produce something like sanctuary and bridge in their more abstract forms. But they may also be more inclined to be specific to particular cultures, and that's complete speculation, but it's certainly an interesting route to go down.
Thanks, Lauren. I actually wanted to ask a question myself, so we could give people time to type in if they have more questions. But your presentation was very interesting, and I was wondering if you wanted to take it further, if you know that, of course, in which direction you think you could take the research if you wanted to continue with it.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting implications, particularly as the OED revision carries on and is becomes more complete. I think there's, at this point, research like this is still kind of semi-manual, but once the data set is actually complete and there's more complete tagging, it could be possible to take it in any number of directions, including understanding how whether nouns are more likely to convert from verbs or from adjectives in a much broader sense. So there's a sense in which you could zoom out and look for some broader connections. There's also a sense in which you might want to branch out from the semantic category of a person or people into others and say, okay, we understand, or we have a lot of descriptive information now about how new senses evolved within this particular semantic category. But is this particular to semantic change that results in a noun referring to a person or people? Or if you were to go into a different category, such as something like, let's say something like buildings, and words that evolved to mean something to denote a building, would you see similar patterns? Are there patterns that are corresponding in the sense of, the locative metonymizations coming to refer only to places that hold more than one person? I can't think of exactly what the corresponding kind of finding would be for a category like building or structure, but that would be, I think, the way to move toward a more universal understanding of how semantic change might interact with cognition.
Thanks, Laurie. That would be really interesting to see. And we've got a couple more questions. So we've got this one. I really enjoyed this talk. I have one question. In the metaphor and metonymic identification process, how did you determine how specific or broad to name the domains? Did it present any challenges to the wider analysis?
So this is interesting. I think the domains themselves actually were not, and this is another potential direction for research. The domains themselves were not as critical to the tagging outside of identifying whether they came from adjacent domains or from non-adjacent, more disparate domains. And so um, in some cases, and I'm struggling to think of one now, it's not actually necessary, and that was the tags don't actually, the domains themselves don't actually have to be discrete to do this kind of analysis, but I can definitely imagine where you would want to be able to find list a number of domains and have that be exhaustive. The reality is that I think would be very challenging to say, to properly delineate that, and might actually not be necessarily representative of the way that, and I'm not as familiar with the literature on it, but I'm not sure if it would be representative with the way that cognitive linguists have represented these kinds of conceptual spaces within our brains. And there is definitely literature about kind of the fuzzy edges of domains, and how there's not kind of clear delineations or evidence of clear delineations from cognitive semantics. And so it would definitely be difficult, and I'm not sure it would necessarily be consistent with our understanding of how domains work.
Thanks, Lauren. And the next question we've got here is this one. Have you ever considered the relationship metonymy and onomastics? I've worked on folk plant names in English and their metonymical motivation, for example, motherwort, derived from its medical usage during pregnancy. In other words, how far can metonymy extend, for instance, including extra linguistic knowledge in the motivation of linguistic structures?
So I'm going to pull up an example. So what we see over here, the new sense mingle sense in North American, especially in a state agent's jargon, an unmarried person who shares residence with another of roughly the same age who is not a partner or relative. It was very difficult to determine exactly which of these senses on the left here is actually the direct etymon of mingle. The mingle sense one is the action of being mingled, the state of being mingled, mixture, etc. But there is a sense also, and there's an etymological note here in sense two, punningly after single noun. And that sense here is of an unmarried or unaccompanied man or woman, a person living alone. And so what you're seeing is actually, it's not exactly as the question implies, of the outside associations and applications and in a Wittgensteinian sense, language is use. It's not exactly that, but it is showing how you have this kind of rhyming element here of single and mingle, and the combined with the action of mingling, which is sort of coming together to make this new sense of mingle, of an unmarried person who shares a residence with another of roughly the same age, etc. And so in short, it's not always so simple. And in this case, I think the best tagging here was that this was a sort of causative metonymization, that there was an action of mingling. But I would be remiss to say that there's a not significant complexity in something like this.
Were any cases of, I believe, metonymization that surprised you during the research?
Trying to think. Let me browse through here. I'm not sure that there were any that were necessarily surprising. I think it was definitely surprising to see some of the patterns that I mentioned of how universally, for example, the causative metonymizations really placed the person in that causer position, and just how consistent that is with the way that we think about things like animacy in linguistics and the animacy hierarchy, and person in the position of the semantic agent. And so that kind of correspondence was kind of interesting and exciting to see. I'm not sure that there was necessarily anything that was surprising in terms of metonymizations. I think in part that might just be because the sample really did include a very, very wide array of metonymized senses, such that by the time that I got through all of the raw data, I'm not sure anything could have surprised me, because metonymizations really do, they really are everywhere, and they really do cover all senses.
Thanks, Lauren. And before I move on to the next question, I just wanted to put this on the screen for a little bit because I think there are two useful links shared there around computational approaches to semantic change. So everyone, you can look at the Q&A and copy the links or take a picture of this. And thank you very much for sharing it, Barbara. And I'm going to move on to the next question now. I'd like to read your research about contemporary colloquialisms. Where can I find it, please?
So my blog post is listed and linked below. The full paper is currently under peer review, and so when that process is over, I'll be able to share it more broadly. And in the meantime, I may be able to discuss kind of expanding on contemporary colloquialisms potentially in a second blog post, but I think that would be more up to Simone than me. So
a second blog post would be a very good idea.
So nowhere yet is the answer, but hopefully soon. And so he said, Kensei says, if the context supports the kettle is boiling, intended to mean the water inside the kettle is boiling, that is perfectly understandable. Obviously, the kettle is not licensed to have a metonymic sense of water in the dictionary. How do you decide a metonymic sense of the word should be recorded in the dictionary? This is a particularly interesting question and actually really highlights some of the methodological considerations of using lexicographical data. There's many metonymizations that are used in everyday life that are one-offs. There's a very common example that's used in many textbooks of, one waitress speaking to another and saying, the ham sandwich wants his check, or table 14 wants more water. And those kinds of examples are one-off, and they're because they're very dependent on context. Now, I agree with you that the kettle in this case is a much more widely used one, and the use of the dictionary and lexicographical data in general is actually intended to make it such that I, as the researcher, am not the one who has to decide if a metonymic sense of the word should be recorded in the dictionary. One of the major challenges of researching semantic change is that many studies need to develop their own standards when you're using primary source material like a corpora and things like that for when a word can be considered as having entered the language. And that results in research that often has very, very good frameworks for determining that, but slightly different frameworks across different researchers and studies. And so when using the dictionary data, what you're essentially doing as a researcher is making the trade-off between coming up with your own framework for that, and thus not using the dictionary, but having a significantly more work and significantly more potential pitfalls, versus essentially leveraging the very careful thresholds that the OED sets for when a word has become conventionalized and has appeared. And from my own work interning, I have seen that process and been a part of that process, and it is a combination of certain threshold appearances to indicate that a word has been around long enough and has been present across enough sources to be eligible for inclusion. But in essentially outsourcing that using lexicographical data essentially outsources that judgment, which of course makes it even more necessary as a researcher to really interrogate the data and understand how it's formatted, structured, and how it's produced, so that you can kind of use that data conscientiously. So I think that's a great question, because the use of OED data is, it enables studies like this, but it can't sort of be used without careful consideration of the fact that in the end it is produced by lexicographers' judgment calls, and in particular the fact that those are happening in a very consistent way according to a consistent editorial framework makes it possible to use data for studies like these.
Thanks, Lauren. And we've got another comment. So as before, I'm just putting it on the screen in case you want to comment on that. So it reads, Jacobson holds that poetry is metaphoric in that it focuses on signs and on the principle of similarity, while prose is metonymic as it focuses on the referent and is based on contiguity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very consistent with the kind of cognitive linguistic definitions that I was explaining in the presentation, that and in fact with the tests of going back to those basic reformulations of X is like Y, or X stands in for Y, and that concept of contiguity or adjacency being inherent to metonymy, that this is quite consistent with this comment.
And there's someone saying that they are specifically interested in the patterns of metonymization that you spoke about. Don't know if you want to comment on that anymore.
Yeah, I mean the subtypes of metonymization, that classification is not actually mine. That comes from Warren, and it's essentially, I guess one. And I remember the question about metonymizations that surprised me. The particular category that was most difficult to think about and to really kind of anchor to as being metonymy was representative metonymy, representational metonymy. And so a word like friend, coming to, initially meaning a friend that you have in real life, but now in the 21st century, a friend on Facebook, that's actually a representational metonymy of taking something, the taking the represented thing of the friend in real life, and coming to the representative of the friend on Facebook is coming to stand for that friend in real life. And so that I think once it kind of moves into that online space and starts to tangle with the virtual world, it becomes it's still metonymization, but it becomes a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap your head around. And that, I guess, would be one that surprised me, and one of the particularly thorny subtypes.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that's everything we've got for now, and we're actually running a bit over time. But thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I wish everyone a good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever you are. And I think from us for now, it's a goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.